Hi, this is Dr. Scott Young, and today we're going to get into a completely new series. Now, I really believe that this is relatively powerful here. This is called pre-Fed banking. And you're going, that sounds boring. It is not. It is history, and it is history in the making. You're going to learn some stuff that you have never imagined. There is stuff in here that is going to be startling. If you're interested in things like J6, you're interested in things like what President Trump is talking about, if you're interested in things of what's happening in ICE issues, you're interested um, in RV issues, you're interested in how the uh, the Nasara issues are going on. If you're interested in any of those areas, you've got to listen to this because you don't have the background of this. And so I spent hours, days, almost a week pushing on this thing. And when I mean it was like every waking hour doing research. Now I know some truthers do some research, and I know some truthers don't do research. I spent a ton of time on this kind of thing. And there's a video I'm going to play. It's a very short one. I cut it a couple times. And you're going to see Howard Lutnick. I've shown it to you before. I cut this one down even further, and you're going to see Howard Lutnick, a billionaire, talking to President Trump. If you don't think this is important to them, and you think it's not important to you, you're missing the point here. Listen to what they say.
Making America great again is one of the key statements, and people don't always understand what you mean. So we always talk about 1870 to 1913.
So think about that for a second. You know, the MAGA hats that set the people off of the left, making America great again, is about what? The 1870 to 1913. Think about that for a second. 1870 to 1913. So I was like, well, then, shoot, I better go back and do some research on that one. And so I went farther and said, crud, I need to go back to the Civil War. You see, all of my life, I've been studying. I started with World War II. And as I started with World War II, I spent a ton of time. My mom wasn't allowed to study World War II. She was born in 1940, and her her dad was born in 1900. Her mom was born in 1901. I'm trying to remember the exact time. And her brothers were kind of that in the traditional generation. So she's a traditional generation, right? So that pre World War II generation. So World War II greatest generation would be people who would fight in World War II, which would be 1927, as late as 1927. So um, people who would fight in World War One would be people who would be around 18, 1895 kind of thing. Those would fight in the World War One kind of time frame. So the 1927 and a little bit earlier than that would be the greatest generation kind of thing. Now, the traditional generation would be the people who were alive during World War II, but they really didn't get to fight in it. And see, you say, well, get to. They wanted to. And so many of my mother's brothers or the uncles, they were teenagers. When my mom was 5 years old, World War II was ending, but her brothers were teenagers, and they desperately desired to fight in World War II. They felt they felt punked in many ways in that way. So it was very important to her. And she kind of instilled that kind of desire to study World War II. And so she and I would study it together. We would watch anything, we would read anything. She was a voracious reader. So I would study World War II, and then I would study World War I, and I would study all this intervening years. My dad was a Civil War and a Revolutionary War idea, and because he was in between the Vietnam and the Korean War, just because of his time frame with it too. Now, so that's my background, and I've never lost studying American history. Now I've kind of looked at a world history a little. I don't study much of the world history thing. So those are the backgrounds of who I am. So when we have this idea of 1870 to 1913, it's kind of my forgotten time frame. I haven't spent a lot of time frame on that, right? So when most people look at that, and Howard Lutnick is talking about it, and it's like whoosh, it's over my head, right? And you're talking about banking history, and he's talking about making America great again. This is something that Donald Trump is into. So if you're not into it and you're not in there, you're missing out on what is important to them. And if it's important to them, it's got to be important to you. So catch with me here, okay? So let's bring this thing to the stage so that we can talk a lot more about this. Okay. Now, if you know anything about me, I keep saying to you, I've been doing interspersed talking about the QFS, some shorter ones. And guys, I'll keep bringing those up, but I don't sell anything about the QFS, okay? Nothing about QFS crypto, don't do it, okay? Block and report those idiots who do that, okay? So this whole thing is going to be a four-part series. Excuse me, four-part series on the Civil War all the way to 1913, okay? So this part's going to be on the Civil War here first. So leading up to the Civil War, I thought was really fascinating that happens. 1857, there's actually a banking crisis. Now, the idiots love to do this, and I call them the bankers. They love to create crises. And what they do is they predictably create a banking crisis. What they do is they reduce the cash in banks. And how they do this. Now, remember, at this time frame, there's gold-backed currency. And specifically what they have is they have enough gold in that bank. So what they do is they steal the gold out of the bank and they move it to another bank, or specifically, they might move it across the world. So what they do is they create a crisis in that bank, and people lose their shorts on this kind of thing. So what happens is they create this banking crisis. People lose a whole bunch of money. Now, that creates a potential in the South more specifically than the North. Let me show you a little bit more about what happens, the conditions of the South and North. Now, most people believe that the South and the North is all about slavery. And yet you'd be right and you'd be wrong. And let's talk a little bit about this. So the North issues are more about some other things. The North has a huge amount of industrialization. They have strong banking networks. They have the massive networks because they have Wall Street. They have all the abilities to do this, and they have huge amount of population. They have all the valuations of products. So because they've got all of the products, they've got all of the abilities, they've got all the cards. But that doesn't mean the South doesn't have anything. So when the South decides to go, you know what, you don't get to do anything, the problem that happens with the South, and the good things that the South actually have, is they have agriculture and land. The problem that they struggle with is that their banking is based upon the collateral of slaves. So if you're a Southern banker and you're a very wealthy Southern farmer or rancher, what you do is you would walk in there uh, with your collateral paperwork. Okay, so you'd walk in with your paperwork, and I'm going to pull this off screen for half a sec. Sorry. So what you would do is you'd walk in with your paperwork, and so you'd go into your banker and you'd say, okay, so Scott's got a whole bunch of land, right? And so I've got, let's say I've got 10,000 acres of land, and I've got 1,000 slaves. And so what I would say is I got, and let's say I do cotton, that example of cotton, right? And Scott's got 1,000 slaves with 10,000 acres. So they would count up those slaves as collateral and the land and how much the cotton would produce. So it's the cotton, the land, and the slaves. Okay, so you got that kind of thing, and so that is collateral. Now you always have money in the winter months. Okay, so you have cash, then you have to spend the cash because you've got to have the slaves moved up. You've got to have workers and slaves. You got to have both because, and you got to have the farm implementation. You've got to spend a lot of money to be able to create the harvest, right? Create the workers to be able to plant the seeds. So you're very cash poor at that beginning time frame, and so that's when you're getting loans. You do the loans, you're very cash poor, you're building up, you have the planting season, and then there's a harvest time frame. At the harvest, you're still cash poor because you've been spending money to be able to make it through, and then you have the harvest. You take that harvest, you go and sell the harvest, and then you have the cash. You turn around and you pay off that loan. So it's a short-term loan. It could be a 3-month, 6-month turnaround time frame. The bank is able to be paid back with interest. So a short-term interest. This is not in the compounding interest days. This is a simple interest kind of point. So that was why they would write up that kind of loan based upon the collateral in it. Because if you didn't meet that loan, they were going to take the collateral or the slaves, right? Okay. So let's bring this back up on the screen here. So it was based upon the collateral. So the borrowing was seasonal, but here's the other problem, is that in this, the currency was fragmented state to state. So South Carolina might have a lot better abilities than Arkansas maybe, or Texas might be a stronger state than Florida maybe, or Kentucky. And so they would have a different way of valuing their situation. Whereas if you were a bank and you were looking at your banking, paperwork, the paperwork, how do you actually judge bank paperwork? It's hard to see, right? But if you're a northern bank, you're a Bank of Pennsylvania, the Bank of Pennsylvania actually, the steel that's made in Pennsylvania is based upon a real commodity. And the commodity that's made in Pennsylvania can easily be translated that happens in New York. Okay, so you can be able to say, well, we can translate and we can trade between states. And this is in a time frame when we were very constitutional. So this is a republic. So there's an easy translation between this. And so there's a huge translation, but there was a massive amount of conflict between the states. And the states weren't thinking in this way of this translation between the states. And so you're talking about from north to south. And so they're saying, we really can't trade with you from north to south. We can trade east to west, but we can't trade north to south, right? So South Carolina could normally trade with Arkansas for the most part, but they really couldn't go from Pennsylvania to Arkansas. And so there was like, wait a second, we really don't even know what you do. Okay. Now, let's go a little further. So the North set up this all created a problem. Now we have Fort Sumter that creates a problem, and they secede the territory. And so they shoot it, they start the shooting war. Okay. Now, there is this Banking Act, and I started to look at this. Now, the National Banking Act of 1863 and 1864 marked an incredibly important time where we see the US banking system. It started to set up a federal banking issue. What it did is it said, we are going to do this. It was only a northern banking people. What they were doing is going, you know what? We are going to set up a system like this. And let me kind of read some of the issues. What they said, what they said is the state banks started to convert themselves into national banks or federal banks. Now, at the same time frame, and we'll talk a little bit more about what it did, Gettysburg occurred. Chattanooga, so those battles would occur. 51K die in these two battles, or 51 die in Gettysburg. Chattanooga dies. Now, there's some southern battles that are won, but these two lead to Sherman. Now, before this, here's the funny thing, and I'm going to pull this off the screen one more time here. Before this, do you know that the northern battles would have general after general after general? And do you know that Lincoln kept firing the generals over and over again until he gets Sherman? And he's so dissatisfied with the generals because they slog in the mud. They don't really do anything. They're so unprepared, where the southern generals are so strong and so effective with inferior forces. If you look at the capability of the southern forces, the southern forces are so inferior in overall capability, like the shoe wear. Many times they're walking around without shoes. They're walking around without good muskets. So that and without the population. And yet the generals of the North are so inept. So he keeps firing them. But something happens in 1863 that starts to mess with the systems. What is it? Let's talk a little bit, let's show a little bit more with this. This act of 1863, and this is part of the act, it starts to introduce a type of currency that starts to mess with the systems. And by the way, when you realize how devastating this war is, about 750,000 people know. Some people say it's less than that. I think it's upwards of that, 750,000. It would be around 7.2 million people if we take it into today's math. That would be like the population of Arizona dying with that too. Okay. What is the result of the Banking Act here? So state banks are converted into national banks by 1865. And there was a 10% national income tax in the North, and it was instituted by Lincoln. Lincoln is one of my favorite presidents, and I didn't remember this one in my studies. It was so frustrating to realize that he actually pushed out an income tax I didn't know. Now, we'll talk more about that income tax that was done in this war, which is one of the sickest parts of that issue. Those 1,500 state banks transformed their way into killing off huge numbers of banks in the North, and they went down to 683 banks. So many millions of people lost their money. It wasn't like we just, oh, your money got shifted out from that 1,500 banks, and then just, oh, we moved your money over. You know you lost your money. So the people in the North were hurting just as much as they were in the South with that. But here's the thing, there was the greenback dollar, the greenback currency that also was instituted by Lincoln. This is the good part that was happening that he did. And and I've talked a little bit about this. You see, most people want to make um, a military or a political leader always a good guy or a bad guy. We want to make JFK, for instance, just a perfect good guy. He wasn't a perfect good guy. He was a massive womanizer. Um, if we saw him and he never had died, we would have seen some of the bad parts of him. Just understand that portion of him. The reality was he was a massive womanizer. Um, and yet he really did some amazing good things. Uh, and really, Joseph P. Kennedy, his father, helped him win the election by election fraud, by massive election fraud. So he got in that way. Lincoln did some bad things too, but what he did do is that the greenback dollar was the first real ability to co-opt the cabal and push them in, and that is potentially one of the reasons why the cabal killed him with that. That $400 million that came from that Banking Act is one of the major reasons why it was an infusion of cash. Where did it come from? It's probably what the cabal did. And see, one of the things that probably occurred in this situation is that they came in and said, we're infusing this cash, but you are going to go down in a couple things. And I believe one of the things that probably occurred, and see, and I can't prove some of this because no one will actually say this. I believe one of the things that occurred, and this is some of the difficult point, is the cabal came in and the corporation. We're going to show the corporation more in our next part here, next phase, and I'll show you that in a second. They came in and said, we're going to institute a national income tax. And it was for the North because the South wasn't part of this. Number one, we're going to get this national income tax to come up with $400 million. We're going to knock it out. We're going to take away people. We're going to go from 1,500 banks to 685 or 683, excuse me, banks. So 1,500 to 683. So people lost a lot of money. They also had to pay a 10% income tax, first time in history, which is anti-constitutional, right? And so they created that circumstance as well, and then he created a greenback dollar, so they had a real kind of currency. So there was a first level currency, and he probably was told that he had to get rid of the currency after the Civil War, but he did not do it. It's probably the reason why he was killed. He was also probably told that you needed to enact the corporation, and he probably was told nope, or he probably said no, I'm not going to do that. And we're going to talk about 1871 later on. We're going to talk about the corporation coming up here. Oops, sorry. And we're going to talk because the next portion of this thing, and this one was the hardest thing to research, and I'll explain that on the next episode. But this one was super hard. It took me almost 2 days to put this thing together. This is the hardest thing because there's so much evidence that they are still hiding to this day. Almost 150 years later, they're still hiding the information related to this. Guys, this is some super powerful information. But Civil War actually collapse to information that you don't realize. Hey guys, I really appreciate you listening to this, but I want you to understand this. This is a key element. This is from this last little clip here is from National Treasure 2. And I want you to hear and listen to this. We're going to play this twice here.
States were all separate. People used to say the United States are. It wasn't until the war ended people started saying the United States is.
Think about that for a second. I want you to hear it one more time.
Before the Civil War, states were all separate. People used to say the United States are. It wasn't until the war ended people started saying the United States is.
Oh, wait a second. Before the Civil War, they said the United States is or are because they were a coalition of states, and then it became an is. We will explain that one next time. So guys, do me a favor and like and subscribe because it really helps my channel. Share this because it's a big deal for me. Guys, it makes a big difference in my life. Thanks so much.